International news now.
What we're going to talk about here in U.S.-China relations is that the increasing tensions between the world's two largest economies is arguably the most important international relationship in the world today. And so this is a big story and a continuing story. And the rise of China has arguably become the most significant foreign policy challenge for the United States in the current era. So that's why we're focused on that. And both major parties seem to agree that China is the strongest rival to U.S. leadership in the international system. And presidents from both parties have shifted U.S. foreign policy to concentrate on addressing this challenge. And so the broader context here is that U.S.-China relations is really a semi-new great power competition that shapes the world, and so that's why we pay a lot of attention to it. But what we're going to look at today is something that comes from a lot of current news stories surrounding China right now, and that is that despite this focus in U.S. foreign policy and this broader narrative leading up to today's headlines of a rising China, the most recent news on China offers kind of a significantly different narrative. And that narrative is driven by clear signs of an economic slowdown in China that wasn't really expected. This slowdown, along with other signals of long-term socioeconomic and demographic challenges facing China, have given rise to the idea that China may not quite be that rising power that we assumed it was even a few years ago, and that the United States may need to consider how to manage a China that isn't necessarily rising and will surpass the United States economically, militarily, and the like, which had been the previous narrative, but rather a China that in a lot of realms it may be plateauing and be facing a more uncertain future. And so today we're going to look at the current state of affairs in China and its relationship with the United States. And we're going to concentrate on 4 issues. First, we are going, I think only 3 issues, right? 3 broad issues. So, first, we're going to examine recent developments surrounding China's economic problems and its demographic challenges. Second, we're going to take a step back and cover some background on U.S.-China relations. We are going to briefly survey the quick economic and military ascendance of China to great power status in the 21st century and how the United States has responded to this shift in the balance of power. And then we're going to, in this same section, discuss the most significant source of potential conflict between China and the United States, and that is the status of Taiwan. And then thirdly, we will return to the issue of current problems facing China, and we'll wrap up with a discussion about how the United States may respond to these problems and to a different sort of situation with China that involves some stagnation. So that's what we're going to do.
And you know what, and before we start talking about this and I introduce the clip, this makes me think of, we talked on the last segment about the Republican debate among the presidential candidates. And one of the things that was interesting in there, every time there was a question about domestic politics or Trump, everyone, or a number of the answers wanted to steer it to China. Let's talk about China and the threat to China, because I'm going to respond to China. And
this was a huge part of the foreign policy debate in the Republican Party. And so that's a good point to make. What's interesting is that there's a lot of divisions in both parties on a lot of foreign policy issues. The Republican Party is, as we pointed out in the last INN at UT, split on aid to Ukraine, but it's not split on confronting China. Yeah. There's a unity here, and a pretty broad consensus within the Democratic Party too that China is the principal rival to the United States that needs to be.
And this is something that we're going to have to come back to again throughout the term on what this means for the long-term relationship between U.S. and China. If the domestic politics in the United States push all leaders, Republicans and Democrats, to focus on conflict and potential threats emanating from China to solve domestic political problems, that can reinforce conflict in the larger international relationship. And could be, paradoxically, one of the challenges associated with democratic politics in managing this long-term relationship. So anyway, keep that in the back of your mind. All right, so we want to start today with the current news on China's economic slowdown. We're going to start this section with a clip from CBS News. So let's go ahead and roll that clip now.
China's yuan is at a 16-year low, and the country appears to be experiencing deflation. Economists say these are signs China could be facing an extended economic downturn. Lana has more on what's caused this crisis. Lana?
Yeah, real estate, because for decades, a strong housing market propelled China's economy forward, and it lifted millions of people out of poverty. In early 2020, property accounted for 59% of household wealth. That's according to a survey by the People's Bank of China. But it also created a leaning tower of debt. That same survey found that property accounted for 3/4 of household liability. Now, that's a pattern that's repeated outside of individuals because the growing property market helped to fuel rapid local government growth, but it also led to the accumulation of $12.8 trillion of debt. So with all of that liability, let's take a look at what's happening in China right now, because the housing market became wobbly after multiple real estate companies became overwhelmed by their debt. One of the largest, Country Garden, has $200 billion in unpaid bills, and it's inching closer to defaulting on its loans. Now, the property market defaults are also having an effect on shadow banking. Now, that's lending that's done outside of traditional banks. Unlike here in the U.S., the Chinese real estate market is particularly dependent on shadow banks. They're responsible for an estimated 43% of China's GDP. Now, another issue for China's economy, young adults. Youth unemployment is at 21%, and it has become so bad that the Chinese government has stopped reporting it. Let's give you some context. That actually means that 1 out of every 5 Gen Zers is currently unemployed in China. And as you can imagine, if you're unemployed, paying rent is a challenge. Buying a house feels unattainable.
So one thing we're going to come back to, does any of this sound familiar? A lot of this is a narrative that the U.S. faced in 2006 and 2007. But let's start
in the lead up to the
Great
Recession.
Yeah, and the financial crisis in the United States.
Because that was driven by a housing bubble.
Yeah.
That was similar to what we're potentially seeing here in China.
Yeah. So stay tuned. But so there are numerous signs of economic problems in China. First, there's slower growth than expected. Many observers thought that the Chinese economy would come roaring back after lifting their strict zero COVID restrictions at the beginning of 2023. However, consumer spending has not rebounded, and it is looking like China will not reach its reduced growth target of 5% for the year. Now, 5% sounds high by Western standards, but remember that China has tended to reach growth rates closer to 10% on a regular basis, or at least over the last, 35 to 40 years or so.
Oh, just that. Yeah, we talk a little bit more about that soon. So, anyway.
Moreover, the rate of inflation in China has dropped to under 1%. Of course, that might also sound nice given the recent high inflation in the US and other Western economies, but there's a real threat of deflation in the Chinese economy. That is, prices are actually dropping over time, which can seriously undermine economic growth. If deflation takes hold in an economy, consumers and businesses could withhold their spending, expecting lower prices in the future. Lower prices could then lead to a vicious circle of higher unemployment and even less spending. And so let's think about this through an example. So imagine that you need to make a big purchase. You need to buy a house or a car. So let's say you're going to buy a car and the prices now are $30,000. But if you expect that because car prices have been so high in the United States over the last, 2.5 years or so, that price is going to come down to $25,000 in 8 months, what do?
You don't buy until then.
You don't buy, you wait. So when an expectation of deflation takes hold among consumers, they put off spending. Well, if they put off spending, that means car dealers aren't selling cars. That means they can't pay their workers. That means new homes aren't getting built. What's that?
That means layoffs.
It means
too.
layoffs, yes.
Yeah.
So right, when an expectation of deflation takes hold among consumers, this can accelerate the downward trends in spending and accelerate unemployment and accelerate lower economic growth rates, slow down economic activity. So this is a big problem for economies, and what central bankers will try to do when they're manipulating interest rates is to adjust these expectations. All right, so the second big economic problem facing China is a real estate bubble and corresponding high local government debt. As the clip noted, property accounts for more than half of all household wealth in China. The property market has fueled much of China's domestic growth, and as long as real estate prices continued to rise, things were okay. However, now with Chinese real estate markets losing value, Chinese banks and consumers cannot pay their mortgage debts, and this could lead to defaults that could lead to an economic crisis.
And this is the deja vu moment right
this
here.
is what happened to the United States in 2006, 2007, and 2008. And we can take that slide off for a second. So the run-up to the financial crisis in the U.S. in 2008, which then created the Great Recession, emerged because of the explosion in home purchases that was fueled by, let's say, experimental financial engineering that made it possible to make more loans to people who had a higher likelihood of not being able to pay those loans. Yeah, and so we get lots of real estate booming in southern markets, Florida, Phoenix, Las Vegas, California. And eventually the prices, but Texas wasn't as bad as the rest of the economy. So we have tons of investment, more houses being built than should have been built, and lots of banks have taken out lots of loans in debt instruments that are tied to the value of houses because they were paying higher interest rates than U.S. Treasury bonds. Okay,
Right. And so they were fine
as long as house prices continue to go up.
Yeah, because you always have leverage. Then if the value of your property keeps going up, the bank is always going to refinance, and because everybody's making money. Yeah. But when they start going down,
and the reason for that is because the house provides the underlying collateral for the loan. Right, and so that's how you're securing a loan.
House worth $600,000.
Yeah, and so if your house is increasing in value, you can take on more debt, because then the bank says, well, if you can't pay the debt, I'll just take your house. The whole system works as long as home values are going up. But in 2006, they start to correct in some markets. Prices on houses go down, and then all of a sudden, prices on the houses go down, and people can't make their mortgage payments. And then they can't pay back the banks, and now the housing slowdown transmits and becomes a financial crisis. When all these banks on Wall Street that have gotten into mortgage markets now have non-performing loans in 2008.
And what we're saying is this potentially is what's happening in China right now. And they've got a similar dynamic of they took out way too many loans to build apartment buildings in big cities that they just don't need anymore. They're already started or sometimes completed. Yeah. Their values have gone down substantially, and so they're underwater, which was another big phenomenon there. And they can't.
Which means you owe more money on the loan than the underlying asset is worth.
Right, and then you get what's the biggest potential problem here in terms of a financial crisis is the danger of default. If big banks in China and big loaning institutions tied to real estate go default like big banks in the United States did, China is going to be in a mess. Yeah.
Yeah,
and it's already starting.
It's starting, right. Yeah. And this is the transmission mechanism where you go from a slowdown in commercial or in real estate markets to banking. And the problem is if your banking and your financial system implodes, then this is the engine oil, right? So that the engine can run. So everyone is borrowing and lending money and using financial intermediaries to make transactions. If the banks go under, lending stops. And then you've only got cash transactions, and that is a recipe for disaster in modern economies.
Right, and realize that this is happening in an already slowing economy.
Yeah,
And so,
Right. And so
it's going to make it even worse.
Yeah.
Right? They're already down, way down, probably half of what they, at least historically, kind of get. And now they might not reach 5%. If they go under 5%, there's some.
So the third
problems.
major sign of economic problems in China is high youth unemployment, which now exceeds 20%. High youth unemployment fuels fears of future economic problems and could contribute to a self-fulfilling prophecy of continued hard times.
There is a political problem here too with high youth unemployment, that we can talk a little bit about in sort of implications, and that is that a lot of rebellions historically, like you look to the Arab Spring, was fueled in part by a large share of the youth being unemployed, being frustrated with the system, and deciding to protest and things like that. And so that's one of the things. One thing that was noted in the clip, I think, was that this problem has gotten bad enough that China stopped reporting youth unemployment. And so that's never a good sign.
No. So why is China now experiencing these economic problems after decades of high growth? So commentators and analysts have offered several potential causes, but we're going to focus on two here. So first, some analysts argue that China may be facing a middle income trap that has inflicted other less developed countries after they experienced rapid economic growth, but then failed to maintain those high growth rates as domestic living standards rose. The major reason for this development tends to be higher wages, which undermines developing countries' competitive edge in global markets. It raises their costs of goods that they previously relied on exports to be competitive, because as their wages go up, then their exports become less competitive. So from this perspective, China will need to change its export-oriented growth model and encourage higher domestic consumer spending to sustain economic growth. Such a transformation would be long and potentially difficult. And as we just noted, consumer spending is slowing down, so they're losing that opportunity to do so. Other analysts have emphasized Chinese President Xi's policies. They have argued that Xi has concentrated on political control rather than sustaining economic growth. They contend that Xi's repressive policies have undermined productivity and innovation, resulting in the current economic slowdown. So this broader slowdown of China's economy could have important implications for the global economy. For the most part, China's economic problems spell trouble for the global economy. Weaker Chinese growth means that one of the world's largest consumer markets will buy fewer imports. This could slow global economic growth and push other countries into recession.
Multinationals like Tesla and Apple, they will face a real pinch if the Chinese consumer market really contracts.
And this was one of the transmission mechanisms for how a housing market collapsed in the U.S. in 2006, 7, and 8, then created a global economic slowdown, because you go from local real estate collapse to a financial market collapse in the United States to restrictions on spending in the United States that slow American consumers from buying goods around the world, and all of a sudden everybody else's exports, because they're relying on the U.S. consumer, but the U.S. consumer is worried about financial crisis and now has got to be saving money, that transmits the slowdown to the rest of the world.
And this is particularly the case for China, because China is the leading trade partner for a whole series of countries. They're the biggest customer for their exports is China, from a bunch of Asian countries to even Western countries far afield like that, and then certain Latin American countries and their agricultural exports that go principally to China. I mean, this could really spread. So that's the big downside.
On a more positive note, slower Chinese growth could ease global inflation problems and help other economies finally overcome persistent high inflation. So you've got sinking prices in China, then make their exports cheaper, which then reduce the costs of imports into the rest of the world.
And then the prices go down, and that is something that potentially, that the Western countries in particular have been suffering from for a long time.
But if the U.S. keeps lots of high tariffs on Chinese goods, then we're not going to get that mechanism transmitting into the United States. Anyway.
Yeah, well, that's another story.
Yes.
Okay, so there is another aspect to this narrative about China potentially facing some long-term challenges, and that is this idea of an emerging demographic crisis, a demographic crisis related to population growth. And so let's start this section with a clip from Vox about this crisis. So go ahead and run that clip now.
This chart shows China's birth and death rate over the last 60 years. For most of it, births are high. But in 2022, China had more deaths than births, causing its population to decrease for the first time in 6 decades. To get why this is such a big deal, consider this. China is the world's manufacturing superpower, and that's in large part because of its huge population. Nearly 30% of the country's economic output comes from manufacturing. But China's population crisis isn't just about babies. It's also about the balance between young and old. If we look at population pyramids that show distribution by age, we see that countries like Kenya, with rapid population growth, look like this: wide at the bottom, representing a lot of new young people, and narrow at the top. Countries experiencing slower growth, like the Philippines, are still triangular, but the difference between top and bottom is less pronounced. Now, take a look at China and notice the narrow bottom, so fewer babies, and the heavy top, a larger number of elderly people.
Which is a happy outcome of our improvement in health and in standard of living, but combined with sustained low fertility, and that just produces sustained population aging.
In 2050, that pyramid is projected to look like this. And that will further drive down China's population, shrink its labor force, and put the whole country in a uniquely difficult position. In the 80s, China became a hotspot for foreign investment, cheap manufacturing, and exports.
A generation later, it was shooting up the ranks and becoming one of the world's leading and fastest growing economies by GDP. But not only did that economic modernization drive birth rates down further, it also didn't translate to an equally strong economy for everyone. If we look at the GDP per capita, the best indicator we have for standard of living, China is much lower than these high-income countries.
Okay, let me make a few points here. China's demographic crisis has two important characteristics that are interrelated with one another. Now, first, China has been facing a crisis of low birth rates. According to World Bank data in 2021, China had a fertility rate of 1.2 births per woman. And so this is well below so-called replacement level fertility, which is 2.1 births per woman. And so the news gets even worse. Forecasts suggest that future fertility rates could drop even further and get close to 1.0 births per woman. This is a really low birth rate. By comparison, there are a lot of countries, including the United States, that are under the replacement level fertility of 2.1 births. But the United States currently has a 1.7 births per woman fertility rate. And then along with immigration, that means that the United States population can sustain itself and continue to grow. So because of this low birth rate, it is highly likely, I would say nearly certain, that China will experience a substantial decline in its population from its current level of 1.4 billion people to a future level relatively soon of less than 1 billion people. And some analyses suggest a drop to under 800 million people, or even close to 500 million people in a most sort of extreme scenario by the year 2100. I guess is that how you would say that. By comparison, just to give you some context, the United States is expected to grow from its current level of about 337 million people to 394 million people by that same benchmark of the year 2100. Now, think of this. Right now, China's population is about 4 times the population of the United States. But think of a future, sure, it's decades away, but a future in which the Chinese population is less than twice the size of the United States. Such a dramatic drop in population will have substantial effects on the Chinese economy, but also on its international status and clout. Now, the second big aspect of this demographic challenge for China is that China is also aging at a rapid pace. And this is due in part to low birth rates, of course. Fewer babies mean a smaller share of the population that is young. But Chinese citizens have also been living longer due to improved health care and socioeconomic conditions that accompanied economic growth. And so the big takeaway here is that an aging population means that China will also have an aging workforce. And this means that China will have a smaller workforce to drive economic growth, while at the same time, it will have higher social costs to provide its larger share of older and retired citizens with their basic needs on pensions, health care, housing, and all sorts of things. Now, why is China in this particular predicament? A lot of analysts will talk about public policy as a cause of this demographic crisis. That China, prior to its reforms beginning in 1978, really had an overpopulation problem. It had a very high birth rate, and Chinese officials were very concerned that the fast-growing Chinese population would cause political, economic, and social problems for China and even the world. And so there was a concerted effort to control birth rates by China, and most famously, it was articulated as China's one-child policy. And in this one-child policy, the state used various instruments, including things like forced sterilization and repressive actions like that, to restrict families to only one child. They had incentives. They also had sanctions if you went over the one-child policy. And so China's one-child policy was relatively successful in reducing quite quickly and substantially the birth rate in China. And so what one could imagine, though, is that now that China faces the opposite problem of an aging population and a shrinking population, you just lift all of those restrictions, and China has lifted all of their restrictions on the number of children that Chinese families can have. And so Chinese families now, quite recently, have the option of having multiple children, as many children as they decide. But there is now a new sort of set of social and cultural factors that have kept the birth rate that is no longer enforced by state policy to be low, but rather is continuing to be low because of social pressures, economic demands on families, and cultural factors. And so because of the legacy of the one-child policy, you have individuals who are sort of the only breadwinners, not only for any children they have, but also for aging parents and even grandparents that they have, because there's so few children to sort of share that burden. And so as a consequence, what a lot of analysts argue is that children are foregoing having more children. I mean, these single children in families forgo having their own families that are larger than one child because of the financial burden of taking care of parents.
So let's just think about the logistics of this in terms of kind of decision making. So imagine that you are 32 years old and you're married, but you and your spouse were both only child because of the one-child policy. So now what this means, and your parents are at retirement or they're past retirement, and they're living longer because of the health improvements in China. So what does this mean? Not a great social safety net, social security for their parents. So the two workers, 32-year-olds, are supporting their parents, but the two of them are supporting four parents, right? The mother and daughter of each of the two spouses. So they are responsible for, the two workers are responsible for taking care of themselves, putting housing and food for them, but also then responsible for taking care of four parents. Now you add a child, right? So now if they decide to have a child, then they have to support the child. And then the question was, well, if we have one child, but then do we have two? Now all of a sudden, you're not supporting just one or two children, but now you're supporting four grandparents as well. And so now it's 5, 6, 7 people that you have to support. So what's happening then is tremendous economic constraints on the decision to have one child, even tighter constraints on the decision to have 2 or 3 children.
Right. And so, and plus the success of the Chinese economy, it's in which it lifted millions and millions of people out of rural areas and poverty where they had more financial incentives to have more children for labor to urban areas and a industrial or even post-industrial society. That always reduces birth rates. And so there's also that factor that plays into it. And so the implications here are a couple that I'll just note. One is this is not an easy train to stop and turn around. You know, policies and public, lifting restraints on the number of children is unlikely to result in a much higher birth rate. And then you think about the demographic underpinnings of what we just talked about with a slowing Chinese economy. And as the population shrinks, you again it could be an accelerator effect in terms of creating problems for future economic growth. You're just going to have fewer workers. You're going to have social problems in terms of elderly poverty and the like, because you have fewer workers supporting a larger share of elderly, and that could not only hurt economic growth, but it could hurt eventually political stability. Some solutions are also fraught politically, like immigration. I mean, that's how other countries with lower birth rates sustain their population. China
and sustain economic growth.
Right, but that will cause, especially for the currently authoritarian government of China, some challenges.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so we're now going to put this recent news in a broader context, and we're going to start by going back in time to take a look at how the rise of China prior to its recent economic and demographic problems have shaped the U.S.-China relationship. So for decades, the story of China was marked by incredibly high economic growth and its emergence as a great power on the world stage. Since China began to open up and reform its economy in 1978, GDP growth has averaged over 9% a year.
Average over 9%. And sometimes it slipped, right? And so sometimes it was 7, but then other times it was like 15% a year. So I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
So during the past 4 decades, right, the Chinese economy has experienced double-digit growth. By comparison, economic growth in the United States and other Western countries has hovered around 2% annually. 2%. 9 versus 2%. Think about the cumulative gains associated with that. Significant differences. So years of strong economic growth far outpaced the growth of the United States, has made China an economic peer and rival to the United States. The rapid change in the relative sizes in the U.S. and Chinese economies has been astonishing. In 1980, the U.S. economy was 19 times larger than the Chinese economy, but by 2016, the U.S. economy was less than twice as large as China's.
So the gap just narrowed quickly and substantially.
Yeah. Moreover, with more than 4 times the population of the United States, the size of the Chinese economy has provided it with significant leverage in the global economy as a consumer market and as a future consumer market, right? A source of foreign investment and the largest producer of manufactured output in the world. China's remarkable economic growth provided resources for dramatic military buildup, particularly over the last 2 decades, that's really accelerated in the last few years. As a result, China's military has grown both in size and in quality, and this has allowed China to overcome historic U.S. military advantages. Now, with its increased military capacity, China has formulated a more ambitious foreign policy, particularly in Asia and regions in China's backyard, such as the South China Sea. In short, China's emergence as a great power has been one of the most important international developments that has reset the global political order in the past 30 years. China's combination of economic and military power makes it the country most capable of challenging the U.S.-led international order.
Probably the single most, there's not really another country that has all the instruments and capacity to do that, except for China. And then that wasn't the case just 30 years ago. I mean, we weren't really, in 1990, it wasn't all about China. But now it is in terms of U.S. foreign policy. And so that's what we're going to turn to now. We're going to look just briefly at how the United States has responded to this change in the global balance of power. So as China's status and ambitions grew, the United States didn't ignore it. It took notice, and it responded with moves to counter China's influence. And so the United States has long tried to manage the power of China, so this didn't just start recently. However, I'm going to concentrate on steps taken to address the challenge of the rise of China by the 3 most recent presidents, 2 Democratic and 1 Republican, Obama, Trump, and Biden. Now, each of these administrations viewed China as a rising power and America's next primary competitor and a potential security and economic threat as a result. And they've tried to take action to counter China's growing international influence and power. And so the bottom line that I want to emphasize is that there's a broad consensus here across parties that this is the central challenge for the United States and its leadership in the international order, and the United States should adapt its foreign policy away from places that we had concentrated on before, particularly Europe, to concentrating on China. And so in the Obama administration, there was a real articulation of this. He sort of quite dramatically had this policy of a pivot to Asia, in which the Obama administration signaled and sort of announced to the American public, but also to American allies, particularly in Europe, that the United States would need to, because of scarce resources, reallocate resources, some of which might go to security in Europe, to thinking about countering China militarily and economically in Asia. And the centerpiece politically in policy sense of the Obama administration's concrete step to try to contain China was an economic policy proposal, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership, that's misspelled on the slide I see. It's not Trans-Partnership Partnership. That's McDonald.
No. That's Moser.
Yeah, it was me. Anyway, you could have just played along, man.
No.
I'm old.
They all know, right, that you did the lecture and I'm doing all the administrative stuff, right? So.
Yeah, okay, whatever. Anyway, so what the TPP really tried to do was it tried to use an economic instrument, a trade agreement, a multilateral trade agreement that would tie the United States economy with countries, particularly in the Pacific region, in Asia and the like, but also including countries even in Latin America and the like, into a trading bloc that would reduce trade barriers and increase the volume of trade, empower and enrich the countries that were involved, and quite purposely and quite publicly excluding China. Everybody but the second largest economy in the world that is in the Pacific was to be included. And this was Obama's, answer to the challenge of China. It was going to increase economic ties, which would then hopefully lead to political cooperation to sort of have an answer to the rising economic clout of the Chinese economy. Obama had a lot of opposition within his own party. Bernie Sanders kind of led the charge. His then Secretary of State was Hillary Clinton, who was for the TPP when she was Secretary of State in the Obama administration, but then when she ran for president in 2016, decided that it wasn't such a good idea. Most of the opposition, especially from the Democratic Party, was because of how the trade agreement would potentially hurt domestic industry and workers in the United States. And so they had valid concerns, but he faced opposition. So he partnered with the Republicans in Congress to push this through, all for naught, because Donald Trump wins election in 2016. He was also against the TPP. Bad deal. It was a bad deal. And so once he became president, he followed through on his position and withdrew the United States from the TPP. And so it didn't work out. That potential plan didn't materialize. And so then the Trump administration also confronted China, but from a very economic lens here, but not one that tried to cooperate with allies to contain China, but to instead directly confront China and its trade practices, which the Trump administration, I'd say with good reason, saw as unfair and disadvantageous for the United States. And so what the Trump administration tried to do is to use a confrontational approach through increased tariffs on Chinese goods to pressure China to change their economic policies and to be more open to U.S. imports so that there would be a better, more advantageous trade relationship for the United States. And so the Trump administration, like the Obama administration, saw China particular as an economic rival and one that needed to be confronted. And then the trade war has a long-lasting legacy here, because a lot of these economic tariffs are still in place, because finally the Biden administration sort of took a bit of both slices from the Obama administration and the Trump administration, and I would say engaged in a dual approach of military containment and economic competition and containment through instruments including increased tariffs on China, which the Biden administration maintained, and also industrial policy that protected U.S. production of certain key industries that they deemed to be essential for national security, and tried to have a different kind of economic relationship with China that de-risked, in the Biden administration's terminology, that relationship. At the same time, Biden, unlike both Obama and Trump, also took some dramatic security steps increasing military cooperation with key governments in the Pacific region, particularly Australia, giving them nuclear-powered submarines to help the United States confront Chinese military prowess in the Pacific by providing increased military capacity for a more proximate ally in Australia. And so all of this put together showcases how the United States has tried to respond to this and arguably will respond to it, because there's a broad consensus, as we mentioned at the beginning, that this is the essential.
Yeah, and this is, and keep this in mind, right? There's this convergence in American domestic politics, increasing consensus that China's a long-term threat. This creates incentives for politicians to look like they're being tough against China, which has implications in the long run for if a political or military dispute breaks out, because then all of a sudden it becomes costly to make concessions and stand down, because then critics on either the left or right side of the political spectrum can say, you're an apologist, you're weak on China, you're not protecting American national interests. And so it can be costly to stand down and cut a deal when in the most important time to do so.
Right.
All right, so now we want to cover the most contentious issue facing U.S.-China relations, the long-standing conflict over the political status of Taiwan. Many analysts believe that if a war would break out between the United States and China, it would likely be over Taiwan. So we're going to start this section with a clip from Bloomberg Originals that provides some background on this conflict. So let's roll that clip now.
So the Democratic Progressive Party is the current party that governs Taiwan. They were a party that came out of this movement of activists pushing for more democracy in Taiwan in the 1970s. And their fundamental stance is that Taiwan is already an independent country.
But this isn't the same stance held by Beijing.
大陆和台湾同属一个中国的事实从未改变。一个中国原则是两岸关系的政治基础。
So from the People's Republic of China, the PRC's perspective, Taiwan remains the last piece of an unfinished civil war. It's an illegitimate regime. It's a breakaway territory that needs to be unified with the motherland. The Chiang Kai-shek regime won a reprieve in June 1950 when the Korean War broke out. The United States then stepped in to prevent a final Chinese Communist Party, CCP-led invasion of the island of Taiwan. The United States has been there ever since as the guarantor of Taiwan's security.
Despite this guarantee of security, in 1979 the US broke ties with the Republic of China on Taiwan and established them with the People's Republic of China in Beijing.
Here things get complicated. The United States, in one of our communiques with the People's Republic of China, acknowledged the PRC position that Taiwan was part of China, but the United States also did not accept the PRC claim to Taiwan. That has been our position ever since, and so in effect, the US views Taiwan's status as undetermined.
But even after 1979, they have maintained informal relations with Taiwan and continued to invest here, continued to support the economy, and have most importantly continued to sell arms to Taiwan.
With the US in the middle, China and Taiwan have avoided war for over 7 decades, but tensions between the two sides have risen in recent years. Emerging as a superpower on the world stage, China has become more assertive in its claims of sovereignty over Taiwan.
So one of the first things to realize about this complicated set of issues is that Taiwan has a strange and ambiguous political status in which it is effectively an independent democratic country that's also a quasi-ally of the United States. However, and this is where it gets strange, very few countries in the world recognize Taiwan as an independent state in the international system with full sovereignty, including the United States. The United States does not have an official ambassador to Taiwan, and Taiwan is not a member of the United Nations. So Taiwan has this very contested political status. China sees Taiwan as a renegade province that should be integrated back into China and brought under China's sovereign control. Taiwan wants to continue to operate as an independent state, at least in a de facto sense, and some elements of Taiwanese society want formal political independence. Now, the United States walks a fine line in between these positions. The U.S. formally accepts the One China policy that states Taiwan is a part of China. However, it also works to maintain Taiwan's unofficial independence. Its priority, the U.S.'s priority, is to maintain the peace between China and Taiwan by preventing either side from unilaterally changing the status quo. In short, it tries to keep China from invading Taiwan, and it tries to keep Taiwan from unilaterally declaring political independence, which could provoke China.
Now, let me just say, this is such a complicated policy that all sorts of politicians always mess it up, right?
Yeah.
They'll say, like President Biden at times would make statements that suggest maybe the United States isn't really still on board with the One China policy, and then they have to walk it back because that would ruin the whole policy. When Donald Trump was elected president, he took a call from, remember, the
president
of Taiwan, and no president had ever done that, or it was like the first call, and he didn't talk to the Chinese leader yet. He was like, hey, why are you treating this country like a sovereign country? And that's because of this interesting situation.
Ambiguous political status. So how did we get to this situation? Taiwan's odd status is an artifact of the currently unresolved, in the sense that there isn't a formal peace settlement, Chinese Civil War that ended in 1949 with the nationalist government of China fleeing to Taiwan to set up a rival government. After 1949, the U.S. did not recognize the new communist regime in Beijing and instead recognized the nationalist government in Taiwan as the rightful government over all of China. Given a new push by the Korean War, the United States then developed strong ties with the nationalist government in Taiwan during the first couple decades of the Cold War. Now, President Nixon then reoriented U.S. policy toward China, sensing an opportunity created by the emerging split between China and the Soviet Union in the 1960s. Nixon recognized the communist government in China and improved relations with them to limit Soviet influence in Asia. The cost of this shift in U.S. policy was its reorientation away from Taiwan. Now, since the Nixon administration, the United States has adopted a policy of strategic ambiguity relative to China and Taiwan. The policy is designed to leave open the possibility that the U.S. might come to Taiwan's aid if it was attacked by China. The U.S. reinforces this possibility with significant arms exports to Taiwan. At the same time, the United States does not want Taiwan to believe that it would come to its aid with 100% certainty in a conflict. The U.S. worries that such a commitment might encourage the government of Taiwan to destabilize the uneasy but peaceful equilibrium by declaring political independence from China. And this is one of the criticisms of the Biden administration, is that it has moved closer with these public statements. It has moved closer to creating the expectation of close to 100% certainty that the U.S. would intervene on the side of Taiwan. Therefore, yes, undermining this policy of strategic ambiguity. All right. So the policy of strategic ambiguity has been the policy since the Nixon administration and has successfully prevented formal military conflict over Taiwan.
It's prevented a war.
Yes. However, strategic ambiguity has come under increased pressure as China's military power has increased relative to the United States and in Asia, and China has increased its pressure on Taiwan and increased its threats of invasion if Taiwan were to unilaterally declare independence. U.S. presidents, both Democratic and Republican, have been pressed to abandon or weaken the U.S. posture of strategic ambiguity, providing more arms sales to Taiwan, or even formally deploying U.S. troops there.
So the thing to remember about this Taiwan issue is how sort of potentially explosive it is. At any point, it could be the catalyst that would start a real crisis between the United States and China that could lead, depending on how the different actors respond, to a direct war between the United States and China. and both of these countries have nuclear weapons. Both of these countries have huge economies and huge militaries now. The fight would be in China's backyard, and so the advantage of just proximity is on the side of China, and then that might make a war from the U.S. perspective pretty difficult. So this is
and keep in mind, and we talked about this in the news segment as well, that the Taiwan issue has been in the backdrop of all of U.S. and European policy with respect to Ukraine.
Right.
Part of what's going on is that the Western alliance is sending a signal, with all of its support to Ukraine, is sending a signal to China about what it might do if China tries to forcibly conquer Taiwan, right, in the same way that Russia is trying to forcibly conquer Ukraine. And so one of the reasons for the extensive aid is also, apart from aiding the Ukrainians and increasing their ability to resist the Russian invasion, it's also to send a signal to China about the resolve and the level of commitment that the Western alliance might be able to mobilize for Taiwan if it was invaded by China.
But this is all about deterrence. Mm-hmm. We want to deter China from ever taking that first step that would lead to this crisis. And both sides, at least for now, have strong incentives to avoid war. It'd be bad for both of them. And so it's just avoiding this crisis that and this kind of catalyst is increasingly difficult. All right, so we're going to end it now with one final segment. So far we've covered how the United States and China have become sort of engaged in this great power competition, due in large part to the rising power of China. And we're going to end our discussion by returning to the issue of China's current economic and demographic problems, right, that we started the session with, and how the United States might adapt its foreign policy, which has been all about containing a rising China, adapt it if China becomes a different kind of challenge in which it suffers some economic stagnation and other problems. And so we're going to start this final discussion with a clip from a podcast called Ones and Twos, and it's a play on the last name of Adam Tooze, who you'll be hearing speaking at a historian that talks a lot about economic policy. And so let's roll that clip now.
How does this slowdown play out in geopolitical terms, do you think?
I think that on the American side, there are basically, I think, three positions currently. One is the super hawkish one, which is, kick them when they're down and kick them as hard as you possibly can. It's a historic opportunity to cripple a rival that America can't afford to lose. And I think there's a powerful hawkish faction in Washington that is proceeding essentially along those lines, counting on this as an opportunity really to stop the Chinese as a rival. Then there is, as it were, what I take to be the sort of centrist fig leaf position that is most clearly articulated by Janet Yellen on like her recent trip to Beijing, where she insisted that all of the measures that America is taking against China's high-tech sector are not intended to cripple Chinese economic growth. Exactly what they are intended to cripple is a little unclear in that case. Jake Sullivan likes to talk about a small yard with high walls, which is the segment of the global economy which America intends to define as essential to its national interest and then defend against any rivals, or notably China. So there's that position. And interestingly, Yellen couples that with the rather interesting train of thought which says that, and because we are very confident about America and its ability to defend its interests, and because we see the problems that you're having, China, don't worry about us taking preemptive action to threaten you with military means, because why would we do that if we actually think we're going to win the economic war? So there's literally a kind of explicit spelling out of the fact that China doesn't have to be really worried about America preemptively launching a war against it, according to the Thucydides trap model, because in the Thucydides trap, America is the weak incumbent that is going to lose to the rising China and must therefore strike. If you actually disagree with that diagnosis and think the American economy is robust, as any spokesperson for the Biden administration, of course, must insist it is, and if, on the other hand, you think that China is weak, well, then the Thucydides logic just doesn't kick in. And then there's a third position articulated by Adam Posen recently in a piece in, not Foreign Policy, but the other outlet, Foreign Affairs, in which he argued that this was a moment for the Americans to pursue not a strategy of raising tariffs and sanctions against China, but an open door policy, which would basically threaten the Beijing regime with, as it were, the defection, the exit of the most talented Chinese, the most wealthy Chinese, by playing on the insecurities that Posen sees as the key to the structural problems of China.
All right, so the first thing to note here is that what Toombs lays out here is the dilemma, right? The status quo here, that the assumption was that the problem for the United States was an increasingly strong China that could then challenge U.S. hegemony in the international arena, and ultimately, if it's more successful than the United States economically and militarily, become the hegemon and displace the United States. And so what you have here is a whole different scenario where a weakened China could potentially also be a threat of just a different kind. Because as countries experience domestic problems, one of the fears is that they will start international crises or lash out against foreign adversaries to distract from their domestic problems. And so you have to be really careful in managing even something that we might see as overall a positive turn, one that would protect U.S. hegemony, because China is not going to rise and overtake it if it continues to face these problems. But that still isn't necessarily good news for the United States, because a weakened China could also be a security threat. And so how are you going to respond to a potentially weakened China? And there's three potential responses. This confrontation response is something that we have already talked about. There's a lot of consensus here that China is a threat in both parties. And so there is, like Tu says, there's a strong hawkish group among elites that says potentially that if China is weakening, we should hasten that decline through steps that the United States could take to further damage the Chinese economy, to further weaken the Chinese state. And that temptation will surely be on the table, and to resist it might be politically risky for politicians, because they could, as Professor McDonald already pointed out, be tarred with this idea of being weak on China. And so that is a real potential, but it has a lot of risk to it in terms of heightening potentially a conflict between the United States and China, because China, any sort of sanctions or the like, China could see as an opportunity to start a conflict that would distract from their domestic problems. The second one is the one that's the Biden administration seems to be kind of tracking toward, and that is this sort of centrist position where it really wants to not give any ammunition to China to act out on that potential scenario where it tries to find an enemy to distract attention from its domestic problems by de-escalation, right? And most importantly, I'd say from that perspective, was the idea that Janet Yellen, in her trip to China, signaled that the United States would not use any opportunity of domestic problems in China to be aggressive to China, so that then China can sort of relax, if you will, and not be afraid that the United States would launch some sort of aggressive behavior to sort of accelerate a weakening China. And so it's trying to say, don't act out as you're weakening. You can be secure in the United States, not trying to take advantage of the situation, so to speak, militarily or even economically. And so this is clearly a different kind of stance from the United States than that more confrontational stance, because it's trying to factor in a weakened China and how it would react to an outright confrontation. And then the final one I find really interesting, and that is this idea of free market engagement or sort of an open door policy, trying to attract China into a more deeply embedded, being a more deeply embedded part of the capitalist global economy. But this is, again, seen from a weakening China perspective, a way to hasten some change in China or even some further weakening by attracting the most talented elements of Chinese society to other countries and the like, because they want to participate in a more thriving capitalist economy than the domestic economy in China that is still highly state-run and experiencing some stagnation. And so this is sort of a confrontational or an aggressive strategy, but using free market engagement instead. So
let me just add one thing that goes back to where we started to, and this is about domestic politics in the United States. So all of those three positions in some senses evaluate what's the likelihood that the U.S. can de-escalate the tension by being restrained with respect to China. And that raises a much larger question, which is, if the U.S. says, like what Secretary Yellen tried to do, is that the U.S. is going to be restrained, how credible is that long-term commitment on the part of the United States not to take advantage of China in this period of instability, demographic change, and economic decline? One of the challenges, it might not be that credible given the makeup of polarized American politics, where there's disagreements over everything. It's over elections, over whether a former president should go to jail, over the legitimacy of the judicial system, whether there's two judicial systems, over immigration. But one of the things that politicians on right and left seems that they can find to agree on is conflict with China. So think about this in terms of as if the U.S. political system gets more unstable or more polarized, or you have these rapid swings from presidential election to presidential election, it might increase the complications associated with any president that commits to being restrained to be able to follow through, not only in that administration, but or in future administrations. And so this is another complicating element of this relationship, which is growing domestic political conflict in the United States, and how does that shape the ability of any president to commit to a deal of conciliation and restraint in managing this long-term relationship?
The confrontation approach is going to be the easiest approach to take if you're a U.S. politician. The safest one. But outlining the risks of all three, it might not be the best one for the United States, and that's the dilemma. So this is going to be an ongoing story. This isn't going to go away anytime soon. So keep following it as the twists and turns of U.S.-Chinese relations continue, and electoral cycle coming in 2024 bring it to center stage.
Have a good weekend, and keep studying, and we'll see you at the next In the News.